And Dr. Tricia Bruce from Maryville College joins us now to talk more about hate crimes. And let's begin, Dr. Bruce, with what drives people to commit crimes of this nature?
Well, sociologists study people and how people work in groups, and it turns out that one of the things that people do in terms of thinking about their own personal identity is draw boundaries between themselves and others. So sociologists call this social boundaries or social distance. So how is it that we think of ourselves in an us group, and that would be an in group, versus out groups or groups that are different from us? Sometimes, of course, this can be healthy. You know, we may think of ourselves as we root for one team and not the other, or maybe this creates a healthy boundary between ourselves and others. But sometimes it can be really harmful. Certainly in this example, it's a way in which there was a line drawn between an us group and a them group that led to a horrendous tragedy.
Let's talk about diversity in communities. How does that impact a community, and just how important is it to have a diversity in a community?
Well, the reality of the United States is that it's increasing in diversity on a number of measures. Certainly if we look at race and ethnicity, or the percentage of the foreign-born, we have an increasing number of people of color across this country. In terms of religion, we have still a predominant Christian majority in this country. However, we have an increasing number of nones, or people who claim no religious affiliation. But if you put those two together, interestingly, so Christians plus the non-religious, that accounts for 94% of the U.S. population, which means that the rest of the religious traditions in the U.S. is just 6%. So what that means is that in some ways there's an outsized fear against an other that is relatively small even. So for example, Jewish Americans constitute just 2% among Americans, and yet that for some is creating perhaps a sense of discomfort or othering when they think of their own identity vis-a-vis someone else.
And let's talk more about that diversity, because it seems to be something that is dividing people lately. Why?
Right. Well, the question then is, well, what do we do with that diversity? How do we respond? So one way that sociologists think about it is how close do we get to others who are dissimilar from ourselves? Do we live in the same neighborhoods? Do we attend the same schools or congregations? Are we willing to befriend or marry people who are other than us, right, different than us? And what that says is that social contact, or that ability to build friendship and bridges across those differences, is in part what helps to reduce that fear and that hatred even that we see across society. We have lots of examples of ways in which communities are doing that, you know, spaces where people come together across those lines of differences. But then we still have perhaps others who let their fear guide trying to be apart and having greater distance from others, which is then going to drive that and exacerbate that harm towards others that are seen as different.
Dr. Tricia Bruce, we always appreciate your insight. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.